My name is Krys Eppstein, and I am one of the core developers on SAS, and I created the Compass style sheet framework, and I work at Caring.com as our architect. This is Chris Taylor, and when I first got invited to come and speak here, I sat down with Shay and had a nice little conversation one morning. You know, he told me a bit about the challenges that people at Groupon here were facing, and it really resonated with kind of what we had gone through at Caring.com, and as well as things I've heard from different people on the internet. And so I thought, you know, instead of coming and just telling you about the features of Compass or something else, I would come and talk to you guys a little bit about one of our more recent projects, which is the creation of our internal style guide. That's a living style guide. And I couldn't have done that project without Krys Taylor, so I invited her to come and join me for this talk. And so while we were coming up with the concept of this talk, we kind of came up with this idea that there were four noble truths, but I don't know too much about Buddhism.
I happen to be a practitioner.
When I came to Caring.com, we had 4 different UIs, and they were all live on the site, and it was driving me crazy because I'm a user experience person. I care about consistency, I care about ease of use, ease of learning, and these things just weren't happening. So Krys and I sat down together, and we determined that really what we had was a problem very close to the Buddhist philosophy of the Four Noble Truths. And so we've put together a talk all about these 4 noble truths. You are suffering, and we were too. Style sheets are the source of your suffering. Weren't you going to talk about how style sheets are the source of your suffering?
Hey, there we go. I don't actually talk with a mic much. You know, CSS kind of devolves into madness very quickly. And, you know, we can add all kinds of preprocessors and layers on top of them, but unless we fundamentally approach the construction of style sheets properly, you still end up with madness. And so, you know, we were already using SAS when Krys came, but there was still no sense of true order there.
But you can be free from suffering. You don't have to live like this. And the answer is living style guides and self-discipline will free you from your suffering.
Lots and lots of self-discipline. One of the things that I experienced over the past 5 years of my time at Caring, and of really, you know, even before starting to work on SAS and working at Caring.com, I've always found that style sheets were the worst part of web development, and so I really wanted at this job to make that not be the biggest pain point of our application. And since we were building a mostly content site, it made sense to get that part right. But I noticed this big trade-off I feel like it's pretty constant in software in general, which is this trade-off between developer speed and flexibility. And every time that you increase developer speed, you end up adding a bunch of ability to do reuse, but that reduces your flexibility, which causes lots of and then if you want flexibility, you have to add repetition, which decreases developer speed, and it's just this endless cycle that never really, you can never really break out of. And so when we first started, I was writing a bunch of hand-coded CSS, and I would hear the designers ask questions like,
Why is it so slow to make new pages that look similar to each other?
and it was a good point. I guess I needed to start doing more class name reuse and things like that, save a bunch of time. And I was really happy because I found this CSS framework called Blueprint and started using it. I was so fast, I could just crank out web pages like nobody's business. But then, a new request would come in.
Hey, could you change that little bit right there?
Oh, I like how you guys get to see the, oh no, that's not the next slide, okay. You get to see both slides.
Double, they're seeing double.
But you know, the thing was, if I change that one little bit that was requested, then, you know, because of all the coupling and reuse, now it would just kind of be somewhere else too. And we got this spaghetti situation.
But why? Because those things aren't related.
Well, so I guess what I really needed to do was to sometimes change my class names, but sometimes not. Yeah, screw it. Let's just go scope styles, content semantics. We'll write a bunch of Sass. Sass makes this really easy. And I was so flexible now. I could just, anything that they wanted built, could crank it out in no time flat. We were pretty happy about that.
But why is it so hard to make this one change that goes across the entire site?
I didn't know those things were related.
Well, of course they are.
So what we ended up coming up with was that we needed a way to make some design-oriented concepts that weren't tied to presentation, so they could vary in appearance over time. I think we should just work on this together.
Great idea.
And so what we came up with this idea of creating more of a application concept framework. And we embodied it in the form of a living style guide. You can have a living style guide and it wouldn't be an application concept framework. It would be something else. Just a bunch of class names.
So we need to take that calming widget and we need to make it more of an excitement widget. And we also need to, while we're at it, take the attention widget and make it blue instead of brown.
Oh, no problem.
Sweet.
And so what we found after developing this and rolling it out, we've been using this system for about a year now, is that having really good names and appropriate concepts in our style sheets has been really the key to maintaining our software. And but how do we know really if there's a concept that's appropriate? So I came up with some guidelines for our class names that we could kind of measure things against. And at first I would say like a concept is appropriate if it's independent of all the other concepts in the application. And by concept here, I'm really just meaning like a class name or a mix-in or a selector of some kind. And so, that name needs to be, if it isn't independent of all the other things, it needs to have a very clear relationship to the other things. And the other thing is that a concept is appropriate only when it lives in the application domain. And I'm not talking, I think we have a lot of coders here, but I'm not talking about like the web domain. I'm talking about like application domain is where your words get meaning. So like everybody has a user, but everybody probably has a different mindset of what a user means for their own application. And so that the names acquire meaning in the context of an application domain. Oh, and lastly, a concept can be appropriate if it exists to support other appropriate concepts.
That's so meta.
Yeah. But what makes a good name?
Well, a good name communicates your intent for that item. It is short, 1 or 2 words. It takes your personal understanding of that item and it communicates it out to a person who may not have that understanding, who doesn't have the background you have, who doesn't have the history you have with that item. But naming things changes them. It locks them in place. Something could have been all kinds of things until you name it, and now it's just that thing forever. It also carries along with it connotations, because what a word means to me is not necessarily what it means to you. So when I name something, I give it all the baggage you have attached to that word. And this is really hard for designers to do because we tend to think visually, we tend to think of pictures. So I like to name things, a big blue square, but that doesn't communicate my intent in any way. And so I often need help from you in naming because you name things all the time.
That's true. But before we can really start coming up with good names for the different design concepts in our application, we need to talk about what are the fundamental constraints of design that are forced upon us by web browsers forced upon us by the web model in general. And we can't escape this, and so the best thing we can do is just accept it and embrace it.
And really, artists and designers love to work within constraints. It's almost freeing to work within constraints. That's why you have sculptures that are made entirely of toothpicks, because the constraints are, they give us great creativity.
And so when we were first starting this project, I really started, I sat down and I thought about what are the different concepts that we needed to work within, and what are our constraints, and I sat down and I wrote them all down for Krys. I actually sent her a list of like 99 questions or something like that dug really deep into each of these different aspects, and I just want to cover them briefly. For most of us, they're probably not too big of a deal, but I think that they bear repeating. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to reset our CSS. Hopefully you all do this. It just takes the ambiguities of browser defaults out of the equation and lets us start to build sane style sheets on top. The other thing that's just an aspect of CSS development is that styles are additive. They come in through the inheritance tree of our document. They come in through the cascade of our styles. And you can't turn them off. It's a feature I've asked for from the CSS working group, but they haven't made it for me yet. So until then, what we really need to be able to do is carefully craft where we're placing our styles and where they're showing up on our elements, because we don't want to be starting to have to turn things off. The second you're trying to turn off styles in your classes and things like that, you're in such bad shape. It's definitely a code smell. So now that we understand these basic concepts, what we're going to do is try to take a basic object and construct it along these lines. So here's some content. It's just a little example object I whipped together. Some content that is completely reset, has no styles. But we're going to add, what did I add there? Some background maybe?
Yeah, that's background.
I can't see it. All right.
I can see it as background.
Oh, okay. Sorry guys, the resolution up here is pretty bad. Adding some background, some typography, some foreground colors, padding. And then you can start to see how this one simple object is composed of all of these individual traits. And it is along these lines that our names have to live. So on our site, we would call this the calming background, the shadow box, reading text, the colors for our for our green backgrounds, vertically padded. But these objects, they stretch, they expand, they accommodate their content, but they need to live within some constraints, and that's where our layouts come together. So highly encourage you guys to build to a grid. We've decided to created our own grid system. I've blogged about it on my blog. There's a link here in the notes later. And on top of this grid system, we've built a grid for each media type that we support. And then we define each of our layouts on top of those grids. And that gives us a lot of control in terms of being able to adapt our web pages to different browsers. And I want to make a special note about the typography real quick, because I think a lot of people on their websites tend to do something like normalize, where they reset their typographic elements across their entire web page. Stop. I'm trying to promote this idea called opt-in typography. And that means that by default, any element on your page, if it doesn't have a typography set kind of in its local area of the page, then you're not going to get any type, any fonts, things like that.
And I'll throw in a plug for the concept of vertical rhythm. If you don't know about it, Google it. If you do know about it, hooray, use it. It's incredibly wonderful for you as a designer it's great for your users. It promotes a sense of calm and well-being and happiness, and it takes you right back to that Zen. Everyone is happy when you use vertical rhythm, so please do.
And Compass comes with a vertical rhythm module built in, so tries to make it pretty easy. And then, of course, lots of people have very interactive widgets on their sites, and we were no exception to that rule. I actually don't think that we've done anything phenomenally interesting with our widgets, but Jonathan Snook has a book out called SMACS, stands for the Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS, and he goes into a great amount of detail around how to manage application state and design around that. So I highly recommend his book. It's just like a few bucks on the web. You can download an ebook. It's easy reading. And then, of course, we have media. So here I want to just show you a few tricks that we've been doing using Sass to support building out responsiveness on our website. Oh, yeah. Laser pointer. Okay, so a feature that I added to Sass, actually for this project, was the ability to pass content to mixins. And when that content comes in, you can basically place it where you want within your mixin. So the way that looks when you're using it is you can say, include for handhelds. For this selector, make it display none. So we just want to turn images off. And what Sass will do when it sees that is generate this media query and place the content inside of it. So you get to see that right here. And this makes it really easy to maintain a common set of breakpoints and not have to worry about if you want to change those or whatever. And also it lets us, you can see here, we can actually turn responsiveness off. So we build two versions of our style sheets, one for responsive pages, one for non-responsive pages, because we don't always want to build every web page and test it in all those different modes.
Non-responsive is the exception, not the rule.
Definitely. And then I would say, height is a scary word. Anytime I get a comp and it has something that looks like it's obviously fixed height, I start to get a little worried. The web likes to be fluid. So just avoid height like the plague. And I think you'll find that things tend to be much happier.
As designers, don't design things with fixed height. It's not a kindness to you. It's not a kindness to your developer. It's not a kindness to your users. There are too many factors you can't control. So just accept that as a restraint. You can never have a fixed height, and just move on.
And in fact, I love it when I get comps and there's elements that are right next to each other and they're not the same height, because that shows me all kinds of great information, am I gonna, how the containers are gonna work and how floats are gonna probably work out and stuff, so.
Artistically, it hurts, but man, it's a favor.
And lastly, okay.
And this slide is all about accepting and embracing progressive enhancement or graceful degradation, whatever you want to call it. It's great if your designs look perfect in one particular browser, but don't be a control freak. It's okay if it doesn't look exactly like you designed it in other browsers, older browsers. Your design isn't that important. What's important is the usability and that the user can find and learn and understand the design. So if it doesn't have rounded corners all the time, it doesn't matter. Now, there's an exception to that. Sometimes I will ask Krys to write a shim and take the extra time to make sure something looks the same in all browsers, because maybe for some reason there's an affordance there in the curved corners that really needs to be used in order to get the point across. And so at that point, we will work the extra mile. But most of the time, you're going to save your developer a ton of time, and really you're not winning that much usability or even aesthetics by requiring all browsers to look exactly the same.
And if you have a flexible designer, and when they ask for that little bit of inflexibility, you're like, all right, I'll do that for you. So now that we understand the laws of browsers, I think, And we really need to find a way to bring some order to it all. And at this point, turn things over to Krys, talk a little bit about designer intent.
So earlier, when I said that part of your process is that you need to start naming for intent, this is what I was talking about. Design is not art. Don't throw anything at me. I mean that as an artist. Design is science with an artistic flair. When you are doing interface design, you are designing on scientific principles, okay? And so you need to know what those principles are, or you're not a good designer. Sorry. So you express your intent because you knew what your intent was. But this is hard. It's really difficult to come up with this intent sometimes because you know it in your intuition, you know it in your gut, you feel it, but you haven't necessarily found the words for it. So it should be a collaboration. Can you go back one? Thank you. And you should get help from your developer.
As developers, I think, we work in a textual world, we give names to everything, and I think it comes really second nature to us to just start naming things. But designers are a bit more squishy, and they tend to want to communicate emotion and things like this. And so it's hard because when I ask Krys, well, tell me about this unit, and I get a treatise, and I'm like, yeah, but
He gets a philosophical paper.
we need this to get down to a few words. So then it's hard, and so we just we work a lot to try to come up with really great names for things.
Developers name things every day.
Can I make a comment? I don't know if it's not rude. I think if they ask me if developers might be tricky because they think engine-wise. If you ask users or potential users, they think more use case or mental model or emotions, which is, I guess, the designers are trying to cater to. Developers can be a tricky crowd.
My users should never have to think about the border around an area. So I would be hesitant to ask a user, what would you call this border?
Oh, you're talking like that.
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
talking.
but this is pretty nitty-gritty stuff. There's the high-level widget concept, and maybe they would have a good name for that. But
Absolutely.
the different traits of that widget, kind of that we talked earlier, breaking things down around typographies and around borders and shadows and things like that. Those things still need to have really good names that describe the designer's purpose for them being used in that particular design.
And you'll see why in a minute.
So naming is hard, and as developers, I think one of our job is to work really closely with the designers to help them learn some of the best practices around naming, and to find that sweet spot really between presentation and semantics, to keep the amount of change required to a minimum. And this really comes from kind of meeting the designer's intent. And
And to do that, we play a little thing we like to call the name game.
so I'll get a new comp from Krys, say, and I'll be like, oh, hey, what do we call this new container here?
Oh, that's a vibrant blue box.
Well, okay, but why do we need a vibrant blue box?
Well, it gets attention without distracting from the primary CDA.
Oh, okay. Well, then it's like a secondary box, right?
No, because this isn't really the secondary thing. This is, blue represents user-specific information.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't we call it a user box? That sounds like a good semantic name.
No, because this box is for, a user box isn't vibrant. This box is to get somebody to do something.
All right. Well, how about like a user to-do box?
Yeah, that works.
Cool. Of course, when we play the name game from time to time, it doesn't quite go that smooth. Oftentimes, the reason we're playing the name game is not because we're coming up with the name for a new design concept. Usually it's because I see a new use of a design and we have a name for it, and I'm like, I don't think that, you know, you called it a user to-do box, but now it's being used for this other thing, maybe accounts or some other thing. Why? And so then we have to play the name game again, and these cases are harder. They're much harder. And so sometimes I think what you have to do is, if you can't, as a team, come up with a good name, maybe just wait, you know? Maybe you don't fully understand the concept that's tying these things together, and you need to just take a more hackish approach. That's fine.
Or maybe for consistency's sake, you need to change your design. Maybe you're reusing something you shouldn't be reusing in that way. Maybe you've invented a new thing when you already had something for it. So be willing and flexible and ready to change your design. It's not about the art, it's about the usability.
And sometimes we just give up and pick two names. Maybe by the third name or the fourth name, we'll start to see some thread that ties them all together. And because the names are kind of specific and not too general, you definitely want to avoid like too general of names because they're going to get totally misused across your app. And that'll be a mess to clean up.
And to specify, I think in 1 year we've only done that once.
Maybe twice. But at the end of the day, if developers and designers disagree, the designer wins. And that's because, listen guys, it's their idea, you know. You get to name your user factory model thing, but this is their idea, and they get to call it what they want. And because the name carries all the baggage, maybe there's something you just don't get about it. And if you have a problem with their name, you know, give them the power to own this, because by having this shared vocabulary between the design and dev teams, it's going to be a really nice result.
And honestly, if you are having a problem with the name, if it's just not resonating and the designer won the name game, but God, you know, every time you apply it, it just doesn't work for you, tell the designer what's not working, because part of our core skill set is taking a problem that isn't working and solving it. That's what we do, and we love to do it. So now you understand. Your style sheets are an issue. You need to start naming. You need to work in a fundamental way differently. But where do you start? You start by changing how you think. It's very common to think of design as, you know, I'm making a comp and this is a beautiful picture and it's got a purpose and it does this thing. And you think of it in elements and areas, but you don't necessarily think of it as pieces of code. And when you do start thinking of it as pieces of code, it really lends itself, almost naturally, into being a living style guide. But you have to reapproach those fundamentals. The style guides must live in code. Let me say this again. Style guides must live in code. For 16 years of my career, I have been making style guides that are PDF documents that I work for weeks on. I make them beautiful and magnificent. I try to make them cover every possible pixel, and I hand them out. I disseminate them to the entire team, and no one looks at them because it's a pain in the butt to have to read that big tome I just wrote up. But what do developers read every single day? They read code. So practice usability. Take it to the people in the form that they are used to, and make your style guide live in code. This is an actual screenshot of a page of our style guide. It's HTML.
And because of the coupling between HTML structure and CSS structure and all these things, you know, having it there, explaining itself in and eating its own dog food, like our style guide is using the exact same style sheets that our applications are using. So if we make a change, it just rolls into everything and right away.
No more obsolete document the second I send it out.
But where do we start?
So you start with your content inventory. And then you break that inventory down from this widget to this container, these backgrounds.
And so like I said, this unit here, where had broken it up into all these different pieces, oftentimes we're coming to something that's already existing and we need, in fact, more often than not, because we start with these things in our main application styles and they're kind of all jumbled up. And so actually here is this CSS or the Sass code that I wrote to build that widget. And this is great Sass code. I wrote it, so it must be. But I don't know, it's kind of just property soup. Like, why is there a 10 pixel margin, you know? Why is the font weight, you know, why are we adjusting the font size to that particular font size value? You know, these are questions that aren't answered by the fact that this widget is named the user to-do list or whatever it's called.
There's no intent clear here.
Exactly. So we need to refactor. One thing I want to point out is that our industry thinks that the very best thing we can do to make sense of the order of our properties in a particular assigned to a particular selector is to alphabetize them. I think we can do better. So these things highlighted in red, there are typographic elements. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull them out. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but I'm using a brand new Sass 3.2 feature called a placeholder selector here. They have a % sign. So what that means is that this is like a class, except it doesn't get output to your CSS until you were to extend it. In which case, the selector that gets rendered is now basically, you know, pound example, and then it will have all this content. So you would never see reading text in your output using this feature. So we don't stop there, though. We're gonna go to each of those concerns that are fundamental to design and to CSS, and we're going to extract the properties out, and we're going to give each one a name. So now we've extracted out a shadow box, our calming background, the color for our typography when it's on a green background, some vertically separatedness, some vertically paddedness. These are horrible names, but they're presentational, right? They live in our style sheets because they're placeholder selectors. And so what we started with was this big giant mess of property soup. And what we end up with is a description of an object. What we're saying here is this example object is composed of reading text in a shadow box. It's calming. It's got foreground color that goes with the background color. And it's vertically separated and vertically padded from the rest of the content around it. I understand when I read this what an example is, you know, what a user to-do box is or whatever, because I'm constructing it from these higher level concepts. I don't know what those are, but as long as they don't hurt each other, as long as I can push them together in any order I want, it doesn't matter if I understand them. And that's why these delineations between typography and container and background are so important. But we made things a little worse in one respect. We started out with 25 lines of code, and now I've got 50. But I think this is okay, because none of that was reusable. We had only built a singleton object for our entire website. And now what we have is a little tiny non-reusable piece and 40 lines of reusableness. So I think it's a win, and on the net, when you start to build this out and you have all these reusable components, and you actually reuse them, you save a lot in terms of total code. Okay, so now the punchline. If you write your code like this, lovely, purely semantic markup, awesome extends, your style sheets will be bloated and huge, and your users will be sad because your website will be slow. So, instead, we actually are not using placeholder selectors very much. We're mostly using class names. And we're just letting the class itis live. The place where we do use placeholder selectors and extend a lot is to make sure that anytime there's a class, but it has to always be used in markup, like next to another class, that's always an inheritance relationship. We'll always create an extend there. But if you don't have that property, if they can be composed, then we do that in the markup. And actually, the developers really like it. I'm a purist, though. It makes me sad. But my point is that this was a great start, and if you're writing SAS code like this, good on you, because this is where we start. We put this into our application code, and we don't start doing all that stuff about refactoring it until it's time to start doing a lot of reuse. And I think, in general, the progression of a design kind of goes from, we have a concept, we prototype it, we do some user testing, maybe we create a bunch of different variations, and we'll use it on one little part of our app for a while until it really starts working for us. And at that point, when we cross the multiple uses, then we start to refactor it, turn it in. So just don't do this kind of this big decomposition thing on small projects. This is for building big sites and stuff.
When Krys gets a new comp from me and it's got an element he's never seen, in addition to playing the name game, we will often have this dialogue where he says, hey, is this a snowflake? And what he means is this a unique item? Is this something that's probably never going to be used again? Or is this something new that you're introducing and you plan to roll out lots of places? And sometimes I'll say, yes, it's a snowflake, and then it works so great, or users love it so much that later on I'm going to want it to be something. When it's a snowflake, he builds it in that original SAS way. But as soon as it becomes something that we reuse, then he refactors. That's when he goes through the mix-ins.
All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where we put all this stuff, because there's a lot of styles. So we actually break up our app styles into 3 main categories. The first category is the library. These first 2 categories actually live in our style guide. It's a Ruby gem actually that gets included into all of our Ruby apps as a Compass plugin, and so the library is such that you can import it into any style sheet. You'll get no output. It's just configuration, constants, mix-ins. Could have placeholder selectors, but it's not going to have any output. Then we have our foundation. This is where we define our class names, where our reset lives, where our layouts live, widgets, things like that. And the job of the foundation is to map these core presentational concepts into application styles that are within the application domain, the visual domain of our application. The pure application domain is down here in the app, and that lives in a different part. And where we have here is like different features, different pages, different products, and then big concatenated style sheets. And we have a lot of flexibility to adapt to traffic patterns, to deliver just the right amount of CSS, to maybe turn responsiveness off or whatever on different pages. And also, this is where our experimental styles live until they've been refactored.
So where does all the designy whiny stuff come in? Let's have a moment for the doctor, shall we? So, like many other designers, my initial thought was, okay, so I've got this page, and I've got this area on this page, and this area is a thing. And so build that thing, Krys. But I had to change the way I thought about my designs. I had to start thinking them in the components of that design. So this is a thing. It's made up of a border and a background and a shadow and padding and all of these other aspects. I had to start thinking of them in terms of code, even though I don't write the code at the company. And so you can see this is my UI library. It's a PSD file that I use to make comps. Over here are my layer groups, and you can see that they exactly mirror Krys's fundamentals. These all mirror his classes and his mix-ins. And if you just go to the next one, But the important thing that you have to remember when you start to think this way is that interactions are essential design elements. And again, if you don't think that way, you're not a good designer, because you're not designing things that just sit there. You're designing things that people are interacting with. So every interaction needs to be part of those design elements. You need to be thinking about that. And when you do, your design process becomes almost exactly parallel to the dev process. And the clouds open up, and God rays come down, and there's celestial voices going, ah, because it becomes so much easier for you and for your developer.
But would you think, do you think that by like customizing your design process so much to being developer-y like that, that you've somehow sacrificed, I don't know, the perfectness of design?
No, design is not art. When you are designing in a developer-y way, you are enabling yourself, you're enabling your developer, and you might actually think of things you wouldn't have thought of in a static comp if you were thinking of it as a picture. If you're thinking of it as an interaction, you're going to think of different things and design better things.
Yeah, it makes sense. Also, I've seen times where like you break the rules in like one little way, and because the rest of the site is so regular, that really like pops out.
Sure, breaking the rules is fantastic. There's one other thing that this enables, and that is if you code, you might actually be able to do your designs in code. I don't work that way, but Krys would love me to.
If you are a designer or developer, who here would call themselves that? All right. So the name game is not an excuse to talk to yourself while sitting at your desk. The name game is really important to play with another person because, as we said, the names that you give things don't have the meaning you think they have. So you have to tell someone else the name and let them tell it back to you in a way that you can confirm that you've given it a name that is understandable to at least one other human on this planet. All right, we're almost done. I know we all want beer. I do.
We're just going to wrap up.
So one of the big benefits of taking this approach is that everything has a place. We know when there's a new style or where there's a new component, when there's a new app widget, we know exactly where to go and put it. There's actually not a conversation about that. Over the course of rolling out this style guide project, we went from 3.5 megabytes of CSS to 1.2 megabytes. Now, we're not serving all of that in one request, of course, but in terms of totally served over maybe a very long session or repeat users who come to different parts of the site, they would end up downloading 3.5 megabytes, and so 1/3 basically of it's pretty good savings.
Also, your communication becomes really ridiculously efficient. I can now say, oh, it's an attention box with a calming background and user contributed text. And he knows exactly what I'm talking about because I just used his classes. He can go and code it now because I just described it to him.
Actually, you named them, so they're your classes.
They're my classes.
And of course, we have all that low coupling, which means we have composability. And actually, you get a lot of variation through adding one new concept. Now, actually, you can put that in a lot of new places. And you end up with something that is really built to last. We've been using it, all right, pyramids are probably a bit of an exaggeration. But, we've been using this for about a year now. I hope we'll finish rolling it out soon. God,
I hope so.
And I think, our hope is that this will last us for 3 years, 4 years, something like that. Of course, it's not all roses and butterflies and ponies. It actually takes a little bit longer for developers to come up to speed. There's just this immense vocabulary. They can't just come in and start throwing a bunch of properties together and hopefully it'll all work out. Like they have to learn. The style guide makes a nice way for them to learn that. They're able to go through it and see everything categorized. Things are a bit harder to debug. Just a bit more abstraction. Of course, there's classitis on our markup now, which I'm not a fan of. But this was a lot of work. Like, we put in, for a startup, a considerable amount of effort in this because we really decided it was time to start valuing that consistency over developer speed. I'm sure the pendulum will come back a different way someday.
It was 4 whole sprints.
Yeah. Questions?
Actually, just going to add to the naming thing there. I find it really, really helpful to actually use a thesaurus I mean, if you're on a map with a star, I mean, it's like right there. So if you have your finger on it, just like start typing these words in there and you get like.
Absolutely. I pulled out the thesaurus when we're playing the name game. That thesaurus is out all the time, and and I've tweeted this a couple of times now. It's like one of my best, most important developer tools is the thesaurus on Mac. Come on, that's a question.
This isn't actually a question. By the way, I thought that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Really, really good. I think that's like the point you're making while about Stylesheets is pretty general to programming in general. I think you can really get a lot of power with something once you name it. It really gives you a lot of development. And there's actually you remind me of a book which has a really long title, which I actually really cool. There's a book called Through the Looking Glass: Why the World Looks Different in Other Languages by a guy called Krys. And it has this part in it about like they take this laptop with like a bunch of different colors, some blues and some greens, to like a African tribe that doesn't have a different word for those colors. They can't tell the difference between them. Like by actually having different words for the colors, it actually helps you distinguish between them.
Yeah, I read that blog post recently too. It kind of blew my mind. I think I sent it to you too.
Yep, loved it.
There's a connection between words and actually how we see things.
Yeah, there's a talk by CD Baby guy. Anyways, and where he talks about in like Japan, they don't name the streets, they name the blocks, which is like kind of mind blowing. In the back. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Language influences thought.
Yes, indeed. Naming things changes them. It fixes them in place.
That's why we take great care. It's worth it. Like a half hour to name something is worth it. Otherwise, it's just going to get used wrong.
It's worth half an hour to name something that's 1 inch big on your website.
So a question about the calming unit, I guess, the calming class. So that there's typography, there's space, and there are all these colors. But we expected calming to be sort of contained with whatever. You do extend on calming and those other emotions. I haven't really seen an emotion used as a class before. Why? What is calming? I'm having a hard time understanding.
Name for intent. My intent with that class is to create an element which instantly makes a person feel calm. So I've done a design that I feel is intended to calm someone, and that gets classed as calming.
But if later we find out that it doesn't make people calm enough,
I will either change the class or change the name.
So is that like override colors, or so I know some of the other extends in there were the generic, generally used units that contain colors and things like that. But was calming sort of an override?
no, calming was only the background, actually.
In this case,
But if we had had a calming background that also needed a particular border or things like that, then in fact, all of our backgrounds have an associated foreground. We would actually never specify the foreground in markup because they're always linked. And so what we do is our foregrounds extend our backgrounds so that you only have to put the background class on a particular element and you get the foreground colors that come along with it. And so the same thing with calming. If you had a border that should always go with that, then you would maybe extend, that border would extend the calming class. Or maybe the other way around, like the calming background might extend the calming border so that they always get pushed together.
in this case, we haven't done that because I want to be able to use the calming background with pretty much any element that I happen to have the whim to use it with. But there are some things that we will make a strict rule these two are always together. A vibrant blue box always has a white background. That's just our rule. And so those two will be tied together in the code.
Any other questions?
Show the puppy.
Isn't that a cute puppy?
It looks like a hamburger to me.
Anyways, I'm at Krys Eppstein on Twitter. If you guys have questions about this today or down the road, shoot me a tweet. I basically am always on Twitter.
I'm less often on Twitter, but I'm at Shotoshan, and I am responsive.